So, hi everybody. I'm really excited to have Richard Mitchell with us today from Brock University in the Child and Youth Studies Department. Richard, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your research and the work that you do?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this podcast. I can't possibly articulate how much joy it brings me to be speaking to you two as colleagues, peers, co-authors, because you were once my students, my undergraduate students. So let me begin to answer that question with that introduction. Thank you. As I mentioned before to you, candidly and openly, you are why I came and why I did what I did and got my PhD and started sharing, knowledge and activism and advocacy using the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Unlike many scholars, yourselves included, I spent 20 years working in British Columbia in children's mental health, in schools, in youth custody situations, and in child protection foster care. And it was during those times when I was working and earning my first two degrees, an undergraduate degree and a master's degree from the University of Victoria, that I was introduced to the Convention on the Rights of the Child in about 1990, 91. So that dates me a little bit. The other significant event that happened around that time, 94, was that I met Senator Landon Pearson, who was still sitting in the Canadian Senate at the time. All of us who've been around a while fondly referred to her and know Landon as the children's senator. And her work in Parliament and in New York and Geneva was always to bring children's voice, children's views, and to bring knowledge of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child to as many people as she possibly could. Recently, I was honored to be a guest, a Zoom guest at Landon's 90th birthday celebration. And she is doing exactly the same thing that she was doing when I first met her decades ago, using the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child to advocate for all kids. So, I guess another way to describe, my early work it is the most significant development in all of our lives, personally, professionally, and every human being on the planet. There's no question that we can't overemphasize the impact of COVID. In global north, as we say, I hesitate to dichotomize things into north and south. It's too simplistic, but it is a way to understand that many of us in industrialized, capitalist, social democracy settings, however you want to describe us, have an advantage. We can sit and do this. We actually have the resources. We have IT, we're getting our paychecks, we're able to adapt, and all of us have that are involved in academic institutions for sure, because we have resources. There are so many, tens of millions, and perhaps more, that have no way of accessing the communication tools that we're doing now. We have no way of accessing accurate data on how many children and young people are actually being sick and sickened with COVID and dying as we speak. I know when I log on to any social media feed that I have, I see children from Yemen who are being mowed down with weapons made in London, Ontario. I see the Rohingya, 600,000 Muslim elders and children and young people sitting in refugee camps in neighboring Bangladesh because they were driven out by Buddhists in Myanmar. I see Syrian children freezing to death now. And I have no way of understanding or analyzing any data sets on how many of these kids are being impacted also by COVID, but I know it's happening. So one of the things I would say succinctly in response, we do not know what we do not know. We have no clue of understanding the impact, but you can bet that it's severe and it's not good in so many cases and in so many places that we here in the privileged global north cannot hear.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think you raised some really interesting points, thinking about it really in different contexts and in different spaces, and thinking about how cultural and historical and political aspects are going to affect young people in different ways with the pandemic. You know, there's obviously a lot of talk kind of negatively about how this pandemic is going to impact young people, which we know that there's no doubt that that'll be the case. But we wonder, you know, are there spaces or opportunities to enhance theoretical or practical aspects of children's rights? So, you know, really, what can we learn? How can we improve? Can we kind of rethink this during this time?
That's a really good question. Again, let me hold this up. You know, I've been around enough. I've been to about 35 countries. It's not a huge number, but no matter how impoverished, and I mean sometimes children and young people living in very extreme circumstances. I haven't visited the Rohingya or any war zones, but I do know that social media and these, you know, ubiquitous smartphones that the entire planet has do open up spaces that children and young people themselves are taking advantage of. I was just in Peru for a 6-week run over November, December. I just returned a week ago, 10 days ago. And watching people in the streets, lots of children and young people, people under 18, as well as their elders, everyone has one of these. Everyone has one of these. My hosts immediately helped me put in a SIM card, which I'd heard of but never used. And what it did was allow me to access really cheap internet services in that country. And they explained to me that children and young people and others around their neighborhood and in a city of 10 million are doing exactly the same thing. So again, to think about, as you have in crafting that question, it's not all, you know, doom and gloom. There are these very innovative and unprecedented spaces opening up through social media. And I see some of the most exciting and optimistic developments I'm seeing are young people themselves using social media to continue to have their voices heard. The planet is in a historic moment. And yet, again, if I could go back to thinking about Indigenous communities, the literature I'm reading from Indigenous researchers and activists, not only in our own setting, but down under and so forth, this pandemic is just kind of old news for Indigenous communities all over the world. They've already had these kinds of cataclysms occur for 4 or 5 centuries all around the world. And there's an opportunity for accessing that knowledge and those experiences that the elders have in their teachings and in their stories and in their oral traditions. And I see that as another opportunity for those of us that are non-Indigenous and instructors in, you know, these formal academic settings and researchers to hear stories and ideas that we haven't ever included before. Indigenous communities all over the world have already been through, you know, numerous pandemics and understand the impact and the potential changes that these things have brought. So I just want to acknowledge how it isn't just, you know, black and white dichotomized. It's so complex and it's so interesting to watch how this pandemic will shift the experience of humans. I'll just end that little, you know, monologue. Richard's famous for monologues. With this observation, all of my students and all of my colleagues, we're understanding that our lives have just been divided between pre-COVID, whatever we thought was normal, and historic and cultural and even political just a small year ago, last January and February, is no more. It's not, it's pre-COVID and whatever post-COVID is to come, because we haven't got to POCO yet. We're still in the midst of this thing, but the dividing line has already occurred.
So I just had another question for you, Richard. So Daniela and I, as you know, both teach undergrad students. So I'm wondering what advice you would have to our students as they begin to enter the field, especially considering that they're going to be entering the field as we continue to deal and respond to COVID.
Wow, that's a really important question, and thank you for coming up with it. You're going to be entering the most important field in any field whatsoever. Working with someone's children is sacred work, and I use that word advisedly, especially from my Indigenous colleagues and friends. It comes out of the deepest place in our hearts and our minds, okay? We are of one good mind, as my Indigenous friends say. So to the students directly, I would say this much. Think about your career path with passion, with optimism, and with the knowledge that while the rest of the world seems to be in a mess, and it is, I used to apologize for it, but I don't anymore. I did my part, and I continue to do my part to make it decent and important world for children to come up in and to take their role in. So you now have that opportunity. There are so many career paths all over the planet. Think of your degree, the certificate, whatever you're learning in terms of child and youth studies, as a ticket into every community, every nation on this planet. Children are needing you and needing your voice and your work. The other thing to think about is that you will learn more from children and young people in your career than we can ever teach you in these programs. And I need you to flip it around, flip the power relations around, and understand that the Convention on the Rights of the Child allows this dialectic, is how we fancy academic language. It is an integrative, organic, dynamic. It's alive. You are in relationships with real people, and sometimes they can teach you the most important things. So be brave. Mighty forces will surround you. I always say to students, do not be afraid. We just had a failed military coup in America last week, just to make it interesting. So all kidding aside, at one level, it's a really unusual time in human history. But you're being given the tools, the ideas, and this treaty is one of the most important developments in human history. Whatever world is waiting tomorrow, the next day, and 15 years, 20, 50 years from now, human rights are going to be part of that world. Children's rights are going to be part of that world. And I believe with all of my heart and everything that I've ever learned and done research into, that the Convention on the Rights of the Child is one really, really important and historic development. So I wish you well in that. Do not be afraid. Do not ever let uncertainty and chaos take your power away.
Thanks, Richard. I mean, very much like Christine said too. I echo what Christine said. Very inspirational, very positive, and both of us have definitely taken your advice multiple times. So for our students who are watching, it is really, really good, important, and positive advice to keep in mind as you move forward. Richard, we've asked you some important questions today, but we'd like to give you a chance to maybe pose a question that students can move forward and think about. Is there anything that you would like our viewers to think about as they move forward based on what we've discussed today?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. I want to ask every student that you have that hears this and sees this from the depth of my being, from the very deepest place in my heart, to consider what it is that you can do each day, each month, each a day that you work with someone else's children, what is it that you can do to bring healing into their life? What is it that you can do in your personal and professional relationships to transform this world so that it really is a world fit for children? And to paraphrase Dr. Cindy Blackstock, there are so many things that cost not a penny that we can do to make the world a better place for children. So I would ask you to find in your own lives, your own inner life, your own interpersonal and professional life, find what it is that you can do to make the world fit for children.
That's perfect. Thanks so much, Richard.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Richard. Really, the wisdom and inspiration that you always bring to your classes and to your colleagues is something that we really value and cherish. So thanks for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure.
You're most welcome. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you are why I came. You are why I moved out of working with kids in British Columbia to get a PhD and to have the freedom to be able to have this experience. I wish you both well in this uncertain time. As I said, we're in COVID. It's not post-COVID yet. And the work that we're doing about children's activism, children's advocacy matters more now than ever before. Take care.
Thanks, Richard.